Hello friends, welcome to the world of Chhuti Presents Escape into Audio Stories in English. We will read stories primarily of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh and Southeast Asian origin and in English language. We'll try to read in neutral accent as much as possible and with our best attempts. We will focus on literature for kids and children. Today we are going to read Letters from a Father to His Daughter by Jawaharlal Nehru. Foreword to the first edition. These letters were written to my daughter Indira in the summer of 1928, when she was in the Himalayas at Mussoorie and I was in the plains below. They were personal letters addressed to a little girl, 10 years of age. But friends whose advice I value have seen some virtue in them and have suggested that I might place them before a wider audience. I do not know if other boys and girls will appreciate them, but I hope that such of them as read these letters may gradually begin to think of this world of ours as a large family of nations. And I hope also, though with difference, that they may find in the reading of them a fraction of the pleasure that I had in the writing of them. The letters end abruptly. The long summer had come to an end, and Indira had to come down from the mountains. And there was no Mussoorie or other hill station for her in the summer of 1929. The last three letters begin a new period and are somewhat out of place by themselves, but I have included them as there is little chance of my adding to them. I realize that the letters being in English, their circle of appeal is limited. The fault is entirely mine. I can only remedy it now by having a translation made. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, Allahabad, November 1929. Chapter 1. The Book of Nature. When you and I are together, you often ask me questions about many things, and I try to answer them. Now that you are at Mussoorie and I am in Allahabad, we can't have these talks. I am therefore going to write to you from time to time short accounts of stories of our earth and the many countries, great and small, into which it is divided. You have read a little about English history and Indian history, but England is only a little island, and India, though a big country, is only a small part of the earth's surface. If we want to know something about the story of this world of ours, we must think of all the countries and all the people that have inhabited it, and not merely of one little country where we may have been born. I am afraid I can only tell you very little in these letters of mine, but that little, I hope, will interest you and make you think of the world as a whole and of other peoples in it as our brothers and sisters. When you grow up, you will read about the story of the earth and her people in fat books, and you will find it more interesting than any other story or novel that you may have read. You know, of course, that our earth is very, very old, millions and millions of years old. And for a long, long time, there were no men or women living in it. Before the men came, there were only animals. And before the animals, there was a time when no kind of life existed on the earth. It is difficult to imagine this world of ours, which is so full today of all kinds of animals and men, to be without them. But scientists and those who have studied and thought a great deal about these matters tell us that there was a time when the earth was too hot for any living beings to live on it. And if we read their books and study the rocks and the fossils, the remains of old animals, we can ourselves see that this must have been so. You read history in books, but in old times when men did not exist, surely no books could have been written. How then can we find out what happened then? We cannot merely sit down and imagine everything. This would be very interesting, for we could imagine anything we wanted to, and would thus make up the most beautiful fairy tales. But this need not to be true, as it would not be based on any facts that we had seen. But although we have no books written in those far-off days, fortunately we have some things which tell us a great deal as well, almost a book would. We have rocks and mountains and seas and stars and rivers and deserts and fossils of old animals. These and other like things are the books of the earth's early story. And the real way to understand this story is not merely to read about it in another people's book, but to go to the great book of nature itself. You will, I hope, soon begin to learn how to read this story from the rocks and mountains. Imagine how fascinating is it. Every little stone that you see lying on the road or on the mountain side may be a little page in the nature's book, and may be able to tell you something if you only knew how to read it. To be able to read any language, Hindi or Urdu or English, you have to learn its alphabet. So also you must learn the alphabet of nature before you can read her story in her books of stone and rock. Even now perhaps you know a little how to read this. If you see a little round shiny pebble, does it not tell you something? How did it get round and smooth and shiny without any corners or rough edges? If you break a big rock into small bits, each bit is rough and has corners and rough edges. It's not at all like a round smooth pebble. How then did the pebble become so round and smooth and shiny? It will tell you its story if you have good eyes to see and ears to hear it. It tells you that once upon a time, it may be long ago, it was a bit of rock, just like the bit you may break from a big rock or stone with plenty of edges and corners. Probably it rested on some mountain side, then came the rain and washed it down to the little valley where it found a mountain stream, which pushed it on till it reached a little river, and the little river took it to the big river, and all the while it rolled at the bottom of the river, and its edges were worn away, and its rough surface made smooth and shiny. So it became the pebble that you see. Somehow the river left it behind and you found it. If the river had carried it on, it could have become smaller and smaller till at last it became a grain of sand and joined its brothers at the seaside to make a beautiful beach where little children can play and make castles out of the sand. If a little pebble can tell you so much, how much more could we learn from all the rocks and mountains and many other things we see around. Chapter 2. how early history was written. In my letter to you yesterday, I pointed out that we have to study the early story of the earth from the book of nature. The book consists of everything that you see around you, the rocks and mountains and valleys and rivers and seas and volcanoes. This book is always open before us, but few of us pay any attention to it or try to read it. If we learned how to read it and understand it, how many interesting stories it could tell us. The stories we could read about in its pages of stone would be more interesting than a fairy tale. And so, from this book of nature, we would learn something of those far off days when no man or no animal lived on this earth of ours. As we read on, we shall see the first animals appear, and later more animals. And then will come men and women, but they will be very different from the men and women we see today. They will be savages, not very different from animals. Gradually, they will gather experience and begin to think. The power of thought will make them really different from the animals. It will be a real power which will make them stronger than the biggest and fiercest animal. You see today a little man sit on top of a great big elephant and make him do what he wills. The elephant is big and strong, far stronger than the little mahout sitting on his neck. But the mahout can think, and because he can think, he becomes the master and the elephant is his servant. So, as thought grew in man, he became cleverer and wiser. He found out many things: how to make a fire, how to cultivate the land and grow his food, how to make clothes to wear, and houses to live in. Many men and women used to live together, and so we had the first cities. Before the cities were made, men used to wander about from places to places, probably living in some kind of tents. They did not know then how to grow their food from the land. They had no rice, therefore, nor did they have any wheat from which bread is made. There were no vegetables, and most of the things you eat today were not known then. Perhaps there were some wild nuts and fruits which men ate, but mostly they must have lived on animals which they killed. As cities grew, people learned many beautiful arts. They also learned how to write, but for a long time there were no paper to write on, and people used to write on the bark of the Bhojpatra tree. I think this is called the birch in English, or they wrote on palm leaves. Even now, you will find in some libraries whole books written in those far off days on the leaves of the palm tree. Then came paper, and it was easier to write. But there were no printing presses, and books could not be printed off in their thousands, as is done today. A book could only be written once and then copied out by hand laboriously. Of course, there could not be many books. You could not just go to a bookseller or a bookstall to buy a book. You had to get someone to copy it, and this took a long time. But people in those days wrote beautifully, and we have today many books in our libraries which were beautifully written by hand. In India especially, we have books in Sanskrit and Persian and Urdu. Often the men who copied the book made flowers and drawings on the sides of the pages. With the growth of cities, gradually countries and nations were formed. People who live near each other in one country naturally got to know each other better. They thought they were better than others who lived in other countries, and very foolishly they fought with those others. They did not realize, and people do not realize even now, that fighting and killing each other are about the most stupid things that people can do. It does good to nobody. To learn the story of these early days of cities and countries, we sometimes get old books. But there are not many of these. Other things help us. The kings and emperors of old times used to have accounts of their reigns written on stone tablets and pillars. Books cannot last long. Their paper rots away and gets moth-eaten. But stones last much longer. Perhaps you remember seeing the great stone pillar of Ashoka in the Allahabad fort. On this is cut out in stone a proclamation of Ashoka, who was a great king of India many hundred of years ago. If you go to the museum in Lucknow, you will find many stone tablets with words engraved on them. In studying the old history of various countries, we shall learn of the great things that were done in China and Egypt long ago, when the countries of Europe were full of savage tribes. We shall learn also of the great days of India, when the Ramayana and Mahabharata were written and India was a rich and powerful country. Today our country is very poor and a foreign people govern us. We are not free even in our own country and cannot do what we want. But this was not so always, and perhaps if we try hard, we may make our country free again, so that we may improve the lot of the poor and make India as pleasant to live in as are some of the countries of Europe today. In my next letter, I shall begin this fascinating story of the earth from the very beginning. Hello friends, you are listening to Letters from a Father to His Daughter by Jawaharlal Nehru. Please tune into Chhuti Presents Escape into Audio Stories for other episodes. Till then, goodbye and stay in touch.